like various political issues. I majored in political science and art, and I use the former to inform my artwork. So I really appreciate that right off the bat. My first question is a question on like technique and the stylization. Whenever I look at your work, it reminds me of like 80s style New York graffiti.
Okay.
And I was wondering why you chose like to depict these scenes in like this kind of cartoonish color.
I'll tell you, it's not intentionally trying to look like or evoke 80s graffiti, but I'm going to tell you a story about where I grew up and how I probably assimilated that. I think one thing as artists that we do is we end up assimilating and gathering all these influences that sometimes we're very consciously aware of and sometimes we're unconsciously aware of depending on our environment and where we're at. So when I was a kid in this West Tennessee town that was very small, we were about 2 to 2.5 hours away from any kind of like art museum or gallery or anything like that. So there were two things that really inform my work that I didn't talk about in the talk with James last night that I will talk about. And I want to compliment you on having a great eye and great style and catching this, because this is one of my influences that I didn't talk about that I'll talk a lot about in some of my other talks. And there are a couple of things that I was really influenced by that I really think for me was the closest thing to an art museum at the time. The first thing was going to video stores and renting movies, specifically the horror section. Video stores in the 80s would have all the boxes lined up and they would have sections. And I don't want this to be really dated, but I'm going to try to explain these influences. And so the most exciting part of going to the video store as a kid was going to the horror movie section, because all the scary movies had not only the most violent box covers, but a lot of them were hand paintings and illustrations, and they were lined up like a museum in a very kind of like serial row, one right after the other. And so for me, part of the fun was not actually just watching the movie, but the excitement of going to the video store and seeing all this art. And really for me, that was a type of museum experience. Now, the other one, which was much more sublime that I couldn't control, was that through our town, there's a lot of agriculture, so there was a lot of shipping stuff, and then shipping used to be all done primarily by railroad. And so we had the big Illinois Gulf line that came through, or Illinois Central line that came through our town. And those trains would spend a lot of times and drop off in the stockyards of like Chicago and other places like that, where there were huge already existing hip hop and graffiti scenes. And so if you were stuck in a car and a train came by, it might take 20 minutes for the train to get by, or 10, especially if it was a long car. But the time in the 80s when graffiti really, became big and kind of, was a big thing, you would sit there and car after car would be this Chicago graffiti that I'm sure had been taken from New York, big cities that, share influences and dialogues and stuff. And then it was on these rail cars. And then as a kid, I would look up and here it was. And it was a traveling museum. And so people used to complain all the time about getting stopped at the railroad tracks by a train. But for me, I mean, it was almost as good as going to the video store, and a lot of the cars kind of had it. So when I'm making these paintings and the work that you guys are seeing in the gallery, it's not intentionally me trying to do that. But at the same time, there's no way I could ever deny that that wasn't an influence to me visually as a kid when I started looking at art and color and pictures and things like that, because I remember how profound those experiences were for me.
That's really rad. I can relate to that a little bit in growing up with the gray era of cartoons, and that was like the my first introduction into art was animation, with like the various like golden era shows on Cartoon Network, and I think a great amount of like Disney movies and Studio Ghibli movies and et cetera, that I was having access to at that time. So I can like really see those. That's really cool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it. If you think about any museum that you guys really like, you got to understand at this time when I'm talking about, I'm like, at the ages of kind of like visual cognizance, which is like, like 4 to like 13, not only is it a museum and not only visually is it unlike anything that you would see in a rural town, but it's also moving at 70 miles per hour. So if you think about like movement and speed and like how sublime something like that is, it's on a 10,000 pound or like, a 10-ton, whatever railroad car, it's this beautiful thing that you've never seen, and it's bright and it's stylized and it's just visual language that you don't see in your community or town, and it's going by you that fast. I mean, I can't explain, like, as a kid, in a pre-internet era when that would happen, just how unreal it was. I mean, it would be akin to like somebody, going and seeing like animals in the wild for the first time that they've never seen, and just how mind blowing it was. And so, I mean, for me, it's something that's saying, and it's something I always think about. So,
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So my name is DT Hyman. I'm not majoring in art, but I really like art, and I do a little bit
Okay.
of it. Do a little bit of it on my free time. One thing that I found was interesting looking at all your artwork was how you tackled both kind of war and how you tackled war and violence, but you also covered subjects of the media in a lot of your paintings. And I was wondering, what was your intention behind that, and kind of like what were you trying to say or get across by making that connection between like the media and war, violence, oil, all that?
well, I think, I'll say it like this. Who is you guys raise your hands this. How many of you guys were born after 9/11? Raise your hand. How many of you guys were born before 9/11? How many of you guys were born before 1980? Nobody. Okay, so really, most of you guys in the room, there has only been a brief period kind of in your existence of being an American citizen where you really haven't been in the war, any kind of war. So in the early 80s, up to whenever the Berlin came down, we were still at the tail end of the Cold War. And there's this really kind of neat period of what I would call the last kind of like golden era gasp of America that happens at the fall of the Berlin Wall, pre 9/11, where we have the internet coming to be, and we have, we have small wars in there, but nothing kind of like is as big as what we end up getting into after. And then we're also at this time with the internet coming in, all these things that are happening to where we're connected to other parts of the world that were shut off from the Cold War, right? So you're getting all this kind of different art and music kind of moving together. And there's this really kind of beautiful homogeny of like art and culture, music that starts to happen. That's why like everything from like 1987, 88 to like pre 9/11, that's why most of the music and everything is so like fascinating and good, because when you're without that, you can really focus on culture building, and you can focus on art and look at things like that. Um, but most of you guys that were born after 9/11, think about it. You haven't had a time in your existence as an American citizen where we've not been involved in a large national or international conflict with another country. You don't know that period that I'm talking about. And I mean, that's kind of a terrible tragedy, really. And hopefully, that day's to come, and then we'll see what happens then. But as far as like the idea of like showing how the media covers war and violence and stuff like that, I think violence is an offshoot part of capitalism. I'm not an anti-capitalist person. I won't say that. I believe that parts of capitalism are good. The main thing being that competition makes things better as long as that competition is fair and equal to everybody. And it does bring out the best in both industry and creative stuff. But also, too, you can't be that capitalist and that competitive without also having afterthoughts or after tears of like violence that come from your culture, society. And America was founded on a history of violence, and we've been violent for a while. And I think our internal struggles with who we are and what our identity is as a country, as a people, dealing with like culture and who we are and seeing and dealing with our past, there's a violence to all that. And so I think confronting everything that I'm talking about in these paintings, whether they deal with socio-political things such as class, race, war, anything else, I think you can't be ignorant to the fact that there's been a violence to our history, and that we have to acknowledge that. And I think the other thing that comes from that is really it's how that violence is portrayed by the media. You know, sometimes it's portrayed as heroism or patriotic, and then sometimes it's completely selfish and it's controlling and it's abusive. And the media really spins that around. So depending on what kind of channel or what kind of thing you're listening to or what you're watching, uh, the application of that violence can have different meaning depending on the source that you're getting it from. One of the reasons why, and this was in the interview I did with James last night, that the paintings tend to like, instead of you falling into the picture like a Renaissance picture where you have a background, middle ground, foreground, you fall in, these paintings with these clouds in the middle are first designed to then push you out of the picture plane, and then they're designed to spin you around. There's kind of a radial balance and composition to them. And that's a direct play off of the idea of like media spin of any truth, how a story comes out and then it's kind of spun around and people fall and disseminate that spin totally different. So that's really the connection between those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. Thank you for elaborating on that.
Sure.
We'll have the interview on the Lyon website too, so I'll get you guys a copy.
Any other questions?
I just had one comment that you're talking about violence and war. And
What's your name?
Ellie Sarah.
Okay.
I kind of see a relation to your paintings the way I guess maybe some of the Harry Hood, Chicago, and maybe Peter Sauer representing the Reagan era. And so I kind of see that relation. I didn't know if you had any interest in the Harry Hood or any of the Chicago painters in the 70s and 80s.
You know, it's funny. I know a little Peter Saul's work. I know who the Harry Who are, but you know, even though some of the visual stuff ends up looking like that, they're not really artists that I spend a lot of time looking at. It's really strange. I don't look at a lot of artwork that looks like what my stuff looks like, if that makes sense. So, you know, I spent a lot of time in the last 2 years. I mean, really looking at like, I look at Francis Bacon still a lot. I look at Philip Guston a lot. You know, these are kind of, you know, very large figures. You know, there's I look at the artist Carol Dunham a lot. And my tendencies of what I end up doing with like color and form and how I paint things tend to do with like my concentration and what I want as craft, but also with the first young man's questions, with some of the things that are influences to me that have just kind of like, are kind of like subterranean influences that are underneath kind of my psyche and id, but they're definitely part of my experiences of when I came to age and started recognizing things visually that mean something to me. So I know those painters are, and I've seen some of their work and I get the connections. I can see it, but I mean, if I'm being honest, they're not artists that I really look at or spend a lot of time looking at. I look at a lot of early modernism, you know, early kind of between World War I up to the end of surrealism, till we get to New York after World War II. I look at those artists a lot too, because I like modernism. I like the adventureness of like modernist painting and how one thing led to the next. I think it's a very kind of logical, fun way to like look at how work evolves and how influence evolves. But also too, because I see really big similarities between that time period and what we're experiencing now. And I see both in the way in which we think, in which we act and we interact with each other, and both how like art is kind of extracted from those experiences, both good and bad. So it might be a long answer to your question, but yeah, I it's there. And if I didn't get it directly from them, I'm sure I'm pulling something from an artist that they influenced that I just kind of like picked up along the way, you know?
Yeah.
I would like to know how you came upon this, what you refer to as a cloud motif. As I was looking at them, saw, you know how when cartoon characters get into a scrap and they make like this large dust cloud? And then DT and I were talking, and as he was looking at them, he saw almost like cells or like a cancerous growth.
Yeah. They're both. I think if you get in the videos on my talk, one of the things that I talk about when I started this body of work is that there were two things visually I was looking at a lot. And part of what I was trying to solve is a format issue with my work. If you're trying to tell a story, you see most political work or like political paintings, like we'll play a game. Okay, one of you guys name a famous political painting. And let me close out whatever window I have over here that just keeps beeping. There we go. Okay. I mean, can somebody name a famous political painting?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll name one.
Here, someone else has.
Someone, I mean, I would mention, I would like I was mentioning earlier, I would have mentioned like someone like Saul. I'm trying to think about.
Well, let's do this one. You guys, most of you guys have probably seen this from art history. Does everybody know like Delacroix's like liberty leading the people? It's a battle in the streets of France, and everybody's on top of each other. And right in the middle, there's a woman, and her top's down for some reason, but she represents liberty. But in 1800s France, liberty's breast had to be out for some reason. You know, it's just one of those odd things. But okay, so if you look at that, a painting has to have characters that are depicting a narrative, and it all happens in one time in one place, right? And it's a very traditional kind of depth, like I said, that goes back to the Renaissance, right? You have a vanishing point, you have a background, middle ground, foreground, you have overlapping, and you have decrease in relative scale, and that's what builds believability and depth, right? So the problem with that kind of construct, because everything happens in the same time and same place, is that you can only tell one story at once. Now think about the way in which you guys experience the world, right? And I talked a little bit about this last night with James, is the fact that, you know, when you wake up, you're getting on your phone, you have to go through like 3 social media, you might have the TV on, you might be listening to songs, somebody's texting you. By the time it's 10 o'clock, you've probably already been hit with 1,000 images, 1,000 stories, and your exposure to all the events happening all the time is immense. You know, when I started making this body of work, this was at the tail end, about a year or two after of the Trayvon Martin shooting. This was the transition from Obama to Trump. This was the end of several school and public shootings. And so by the time you would focus and try to make a painting on one event to really capture it, something else had already happened, and that was old news. And by the time you got to that, a new thing happened, and then all of a sudden you're always behind. And what really I was feeling desperate about, or feeling upset about, and what I really wanted to respond to, was not one singular event. It was the fact that we were constantly being bombarded and overwhelmed by, you know, 50 or 100 bad things that were happening all at once, all the time. And it was in a constant cyclical kind of way. And so these paintings have all these parts going on because this is what was happening. It wasn't one bad thing was happening. It's not a painting about one thing. It's a painting about everything that's happening all at once at the same time, and how we're constantly overwhelmed. And, you know, pardon the expression, I feel like we're mentally getting our ass kicked by like this much stuff that we're trying to deal with at one time. And with the media the way it is now, with social media and everything else in the news, we're constantly aware of it. There's no way to get away from it. And then when it's slanted or it's misrepresented, you know, how you feel about it afterwards. You know, sometimes if the media's coverage of something is just, you know, do you feel good about it? Or if it's unjust and it takes a while to dig out, like how frustrated you feel even after you've recovered from that thing. And so a traditional kind of old format like the Delacroix liberty leading the people couldn't carry that idea. But this cloud dust up fight, to get back to the original start of this question, everything's happening in that. And at the same time, when everything's happening, you can't see all the parts of what's happening at the same time. You see snippets, you see like detritus or debris coming from it. You see kind of like the cataclysm of all these things coexisting in environment, but they're moving so fast and kind of together, kind of like that train I talked about earlier. They're spinning and moving so quick, you're just getting the objects and things. And what you're left with is kind of like the overwhelmed feeling of, my gosh, how am I going to process all of this? And I think that these paintings are really trying to navigate and trying to illustrate what the American id happens after you go through so many years of trying to comprehend all that stuff at the same time. They're about being overwhelmed, you know. You said the dust up, and you said something else. You said like cancer cells or something organic.
Yes.
Yeah. I think as they build and stack, they feel organic the way they try to move. You know, a painting is a static image. It doesn't move, right? It's a still thing, but you can imply movement. You can imply energy. And with your color palette, you can imply that something is moving toward you, that it has life, or that it has heat, or that it has energy with how you arrange and you use your colors. And so as these things kind of build and accumulate all this kind of like turmoil and chaos and animosity, violent and all these other things, they feel like organic things moving. Maybe not cancers or things like that, but they're definitely organic. Yeah, feel like I nailed that one. What else? You guys are asking good questions, man. You guys are good viewers. You can always tell if people have looked at the show by the quality of questions that they ask, and these are great questions.
This is a more technical question.
Okay.
What mediums are you using when you paint?
I paint, these are all in oils. Okay.
Okay.
I use oil paint. I use a certain type of flat paintbrush that allows me to get this kind of very super hyper blended look. I use a company, they're called Princeton. I use Princeton synthetic flats. I don't really use rounds or other things like that, because what I'm trying to do is put the paint off and align it next to each other. That way I can either do hard edge or soft end blends when the values and the colors meet. And so by lining that up and arranging it like that, you're basically taking a dry brush through, excuse me, where your blocked color meets up, and you're dry painting over those two edges, which is what softens it down and lays it down. And the more times you do that over the years, the more touch you kind of get. You know, I have people ask me if these are airbrushed. They're not airbrushed. They're done with the very same tools that painters from the 1500s use. I use paint thinner in my underpaintings. I do very traditional underpaintings. You know, these are done usually with a yellow ochre kind of value painting, or a light drawing that then has a value painting under it, and then I build it up with the color. Then I use Galkid Light, which is another Gamblin product, for my painting medium, which thins down and speeds up transparency and translucency, but also speeds up the drawing a little bit. You know, with oil paint, the benefit of that is that you have an extended drying time, but also too with this medium, you can speed up that drying time just a little bit, so it's not as long. But it also helps with the flow of how the paint can mix into each other. It helps kind of like thin out the paint, so it does that, so that they lay down outside of the edges and ridges that are built around some of the forms. They lay down fairly flat.
Well, yeah, I was just wondering because like they almost look acrylic, but I think so they're oils. I was wondering if you like did a hybrid or not. But
I think there's a funny thing about that, and people say that, and I think people attribute the acrylicness of why they think they're acrylic to palette, that these colors are only able to be obtained in an acrylic paint palette, and that's just not the case. These are very traditional kind of colors I'm using. What makes them stand out and what makes them pop is how they're arranged next to other colors, one. Another thing, two, is the amount of value contrast that is in the form. So you can build contrast in a painting in two ways, right? Through color saturation and color theory, you know, warm colors next to cool colors. Also low saturation colors next to high saturation colors. We know that high saturation colors are color purity or more aggressive and active in space. And the other thing is the light and dark values of those colors. When you're aligning very, very bright tinted up things next to very things that are like lower registered or dulled down. So it's the contrast and saturation of these that make people think they're acrylic, but they're traditional kind of oil paints. And what you're really seeing is the arrangement of the colors and how color operates to make them feel kind of almost neon, like what would be a spray paint acrylic palette. But it's really just the arrangement of the colors. So if you guys have to take a color theory class or using color, whatever it's called over there, if you get a part of design, pay attention to that, because some of the things that you can do with color are just amazing if you have the knowledge to how to arrange it, how to manipulate it, where you structure it in your paintings. And then the other thing too is how to chromatically balance a painting. You know, you have the formal balance of your composition, how you line it up and you put your elements. But when you add color to it, then you've got to balance the color out. You've got to balance chromatically where your colors are going and how the color within your forms and shapes operate to make your painting function. So
I think this is my last question. Professor James and I have had a few discussions when it comes to political artworks and what exactly art can accomplish. So I was wondering what you hope to accomplish by bringing these messages to the forefront.
Well, I don't know that you could, if anybody has been on Facebook in the last 4 years, I don't care how many facts or perceived facts you hit anybody with, you're not going to change anyone's opinion politically, usually, correct? You might become more informed yourself and change or become enlightened, but you're not going to do that. So, what you're really trying to do with political artwork is you're trying to do two things. I think you're trying to raise an awareness about the world or the environment that you live in as a way of communicating with fellow humans about how you feel about certain industries or certain structures or constructs within our society. And sometimes that's saying, I'm painting this, or I'm drawing this, or I'm depicting this, or I'm performing this because I don't feel so good about this. And you're really questioning. You're not making definitive statements, because as soon as you really, I think, start to make a super definitive statement in a political work, you run the risk of that idea becoming outdated very quick. We change through ideologies probably faster than any time we in the history of human beings right now. And so what I'm trying to do is raise an awareness of things that just are. And I'm trying to raise questions within things that I question and think about in society. And sometimes I don't have answers. I just know I think about it. You know, I'll talk a lot about, a lot of the parts of the work are about power. I don't know how I feel about power. I could say that I would assume that it's probably better to have power than not power. Uh, I would assume in class system or wealth that it's better to have money than to not have money. But also too, there's problems that come with both of those things. You know, there's responsibility and how your morals and ethics navigate when you have those things, and how you treat other human beings when you do have that. And so a lot of what I'm bringing to light is the things that I just think about that I don't have answers to. And that's really what a painting does, right? Or a work of art is, it's not always just definitively about answers in any kind of political system or thing. It's really about stuff that I question all the time and that I think about. And then selfishly too, some of the things that I paint them because I like to paint them and I'm kind of excited about it. You know, I talked about Philip Guston, and one of the things that we talk, if we talk about political art, is, you know, there's a big Philip Guston retrospective that has been going around that some institutions have canceled having this show. Can you imagine canceling a Philip Guston show? It blows my mind. But part of the reasoning behind it is that they were worried that, is everybody like familiar with like Guston's like clan paintings that he did of the little clan guys in the cars and they're driving
Yes.
around and they're doing that. And a lot of people don't understand that, you know, Philip Guston was an American artist who lived through the Depression and the World Wars, and he was also a Jewish artist. And so obviously he was aware of the Holocaust and how, you know, the Nazi after effects and how that came to be with American culture and clan figures. And Guston, in a very honest interview one time, he said, I wonder what it's like, you know, to be that evil, like to think like that, because he couldn't comprehend it. And he was aware of the pain that it had caused like people that were connected to him. And he said, to go around, to be plotting, to be thinking, to be doing, I mean, like, what is that like? And so, I mean, of course, you know, he's obviously against it, but he started those paintings because he's trying to question, because he's just trying to understand it. He's trying to make sense of it. And I think that's a very pure kind of human response to like bad things, like you're trying to understand it. Like, I don't know where any of you guys voted. I won't get into this, but, you know, if you took the last election and you're trying to understand somebody on the other side, however you voted, I mean, did you ever just sit down once and really ask them, well, why do you like this person? And sometimes when you would get an answer and you'd be like, that's how you see this. And like the further away like your ideas were, the more like astounding, like the idea that you could be living in the same world sometimes. And I think that's what Guston was really, you know, juggling or trying to comprehend it. I mean, a lot of the parts in the paintings, you know, sometimes I'll put it there because I'm trying to comprehend it. I'm trying to understand, you know, how we're okay with, you know, like institutions or like, you know, certain parts of the prison system, or, you know, how divided our class system is to the point where like, there's not a middle class anymore, really. I mean, that's bizarre to me, you know, that there's not, the middle class was always the most important class, because if you think of capitalism as a ladder, and I use this diagram to my students to explain capitalism, is that as your family acquires wealth, you can go up a rung. And then your kid starts at a higher rung than you did, and then they can work up, and you can eventually work up. And the bad, you know, is, so you talk about, well, what if somebody's wealthy? Well, instead of starting at rung 1, they already start at rung 7, right? But you have to have the rungs in the middle to be able to transition up. And so if you have no middle class, imagine if there's 14 rungs on our ladder, we have 14, 13, and 12, and all the ones in the middle are missing, and then you only have 1, 2, 3. There's no way for 1, 2, 3, a person climbing that ladder to ever jump up and grab the 12th or 11th rung, because they'll just fall off the ladder. And so that's the scary thing about not having the middle class, is like the transitionary class is gone. So, I mean, that's part of what I'm thinking about in this too. Also, I think a contradiction of, like, for me being from the South, like our own history, and like, I like being from the South, but I don't like or agree with part of its history. And, and we come from an oral tradition. We're storytellers. You guys are in Arkansas right now, as we're artists. What is Southern art? Somebody said, well, you say you're a Southern artist. What does that mean? I said, well, what are great characteristics of Southern art? One, it's an oral tradition. We tell stories. We carry stories through our families to each other. We do it in our music. We do it in our art. We do it in our poetry. I mean, it can be my painting show, or you can put on, like, I listened to Outkast today, and it's as good as it was back in 1999. Right?
Man of taste.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, I mean, Outkast, for me, if somebody asks, what's the best thing that came out of Southern culture the last 30 years? I said, it's Outkast. I mean, there's no other argument. Art, poetry, movie, maybe a Beast of the Southern Wild, if anybody's ever seen that movie, which is an amazing, beautiful movie. Go watch it if you get done with this, if you trust my Outkast answer. But I'm like, it's Outkast. And why did Outkast work so well for everybody? Didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter if you were male, female, black, or white. I mean, it didn't matter where you were on the spectrum. Why did Outkast work so well, especially in the South? It was the stories, right? The stories and the song. I mean, the form of the rap and the duo of the two, and the chemistry was amazing, but the stories are amazing. There are real stories in there. And the other thing is flavor. I think that's the other indicative thing about Southern culture, is like flavor. Like, we have flavor in everything we do, whether it's like dancing or painting or our poetry or our film or our cinema. There's a flavor and there's a style to that flavor. That's why so much stuff in the South is stylized, because we want to be individuals with how we portray our flavor in the art and the craft and the things that we make. And so, I mean, I think those things are important to me too.
I have a question. Does anyone else have a question? No. So one thing that I noticed in your work is kind of the difference between your charcoal work versus the paintings. And so first, I kind of wanted to know what your process was, if you did the charcoals first and then moved on to the paintings. Because I noticed and I kind of appreciated the differences between them. And like you mentioned before about the color and the color theory, how even though structurally the two paintings are very, very similar. It's basically the same elements, but they give off such different vibes and feelings because of the material and the craft.
Sure.
And I thought it was kind of even interesting how in the charcoals, even at least it seemed like there was even a bit more detail in all the work versus whenever it was blown up, kind of like Nick mentioned, was kind of more simplified, more cartoon stylized, versus in the charcoal, there's a bit more detail, maybe a couple more of the orbs or the smoke clouds in there. True, and more powerful details. So I was interested in that kind of aspect of your craft, going from charcoal to paint, if there was maybe something before that.
My process is usually this. I found that I'm a very seasonal worker, and part of it is what my job is, and part of it is just how I create. Usually in the winter, in the fall, in the early part before we get to spring, I will make a set of drawings, and I will end up taking that set of drawings, and I will pick the best drawings from that set or that body of work that I make, and those will be the things that I convert into paintings. When I transition those drawings into paintings, I'm using the drawings for the compositional structure, but I don't always have the color planned out in the paintings. So I'm leaving two things to organically happen in the transition between the drawings and the painting. Part of that is color decisions, and a lot of the things I'll use local color, which just means the color of the thing as it would exist in nature. And then some of the color is purely it's invented color, because I'm thinking that this thing is here and I use local color. What would be the best color in the surrounding area to activate that more, to make it either more potent, to put it back, or to bring it up in the picture. And the other part that always happens too is that there's something that inevitably changes or happens when I'm transitioning from the drawing to painting that wasn't there before, that I don't plan on, that just kind of shows up. And I think part of what I have to do is be open to when that moment happens, letting that happen in the work and putting it in there. And it's funny. So when I get done with the body of paintings, what I learned from that body of paintings starts the next set of drawings. So it always works in that cycle, especially did with these. This is exactly how it worked with this body of work. It was that cycle, you know, from mid 2015 to the end of 19.
Cool, thank you very much for that answer.
Do what? I'm sorry.
Just thank you for that answer.
Oh yeah, sure. You're welcome. Yeah, good question though. Yeah.
Does anybody have one last question before we cut it loose?
Yeah, can I ask one more, please? Howdy, I'm Wilson. And I'm sorry, I'm Frank.
Oh, there, I was like, where is that? Where's that coming from? I couldn't tell.
So I noticed some of the landscapes you've got at the bottom of some of the paintings. They have these like balls or orbs right there at the very bottom, kind of subterranean. And
That's right.
I thought about. I can't really think of what the meteor symbol, what they symbolize is.
Okay, they symbolize two things. If a lot of the paintings are talking about war and conflict and stuff like that, almost every war that we've had in the last 50 years has been about natural resources, specifically oil, correct? So what is oil made from? Anybody know how we get oil?
Old dinosaurs.
Yeah, anything, old fossil. So we don't have dinosaurs anymore. So basically what's going to end up getting buried in the ground that's going to be crushed to create the oil a million years from now? Us, right? We're all little cans of Havoline. So when you have a war about oil that ends up putting human beings in the ground that will eventually be crushed to become the thing that a war is fighting about, it talks about the absurdity of the cycle of life. The other reason why I put those down there too is it talks about environmental issues. This is also how like fracking happens when you get gas from like shale rock, and shale rock exists underground. And the danger of like accessing like gas and oil from like shale rock is that when it comes from that, it leaks into your water source and destroys everything that's in the subterranean. So when I'm doing a painting, I'm thinking about how many things when I do those terrains, about how what's happening above ground affects what's happening underneath, and how some of those things are very human, and how some of those things just are really about a larger kind of biological network like the earth is. You know, the earth has its own defense mechanisms. You know, there are certain things that when we mess up big enough that the earth can do to like just flush us all out and start over. I mean, it's happened 3 or 4 times. So I put that in some of the landscapes because I'm not always the best environmentalist. I'll admit it. I could talk about human politics all day. I think most of us really have to work about committing to a lifestyle that's more environmental. Like for me, mindfulness. I'm working on being more mindfulness about the environment. I remember when I was a kid, our big thing was we stopped littering. Before in the 70s and the 60s, there was trash everywhere. Now it's absurd to even think that anybody would litter anywhere, right? I mean, like littering, if you saw somebody littering, like, what are you doing? You know, it would be as immediate reaction as if you saw somebody like hitting a kid. You'd be like, no, you can't do that, right? I think the nuance of the issues that your generation brings up now with the environment are things that bigger issues that we need to think of that demand a greater mindfulness. And so that's something that I'm working, you know, I have to think about that. And that's something I got to be honest, I'm working on all the time. I'm working on the mindfulness of it. And I'm thinking of it. And as I'm working on being mindful and trying to transition into thinking about that kind of stuff, I'm trying to put it in the work because that's really where I think about it. It's when I'm forced to paint it.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the answer.
Yes.
Any last comments for us, Jason?
For me?
Yeah, from you to us.
No, I think you guys look like, yeah. One, thank you for the questions. These are really like great, thoughtful, informed questions. This isn't me just like audience appeasing, but I mean, seriously, I've done this a couple of times with this group of paintings starting from like 15 up. And there have been good comments, and then there have been some absurd comments that really don't have anything to do with the work. And I think everything that you guys asked was very mindful, very specific to the work. I'd also like to compliment you on like your eyes and the way you disseminated the pictures. One thing that I get frustrated with, especially with the younger audiences, is because you guys are used to looking at stuff so quick, you're not able to slow down and really look at pictures. And that has not been the case. Your attention to detail and like how you're analytically breaking down the pictures and what you're pulling out of them and the questions you ask, for me, I feel is very generous as a viewer. And I thank you for giving the work that much consideration.
Give him a round of applause.
Thank you guys. Look at how big my Diet Coke is. This is how you make as an artist. You have to get a Diet Coke as big as a fire hydrant. That's survival right there.
Don't listen to him. His wife told me he's addicted, like 6 or 7 a day. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. And sorry for all the digital stuff. I appreciate your patience with us on all this.
Yeah, sure. If any of you guys do me a favor, if y'all go out, is there an opening happening right now, or are you guys the opening?
We're part of the opening, yes.
Okay. If y'all would take some pictures of the show or like add me on Instagram, I would love to get some live pictures of the show from like somebody who's at the show looking at its point of view. That would be fantastic. If you'll do me that favor, I would be very appreciative.
Why don't you put your handle on the chat? I'll open that.
All right, let me see it real quick. Then, of course, look at my website whenever, but it is.
I have way too many things on my Instagram. But I love our stuff.
No, it's great.
There we go. I'm really good about Facebook stuff, but I'm having to really work on doing 2 social medias. I thought for sure MySpace was going to make it and I wouldn't have to go for like a 3rd. It didn't happen at all. It's gone. So I'm trying to convert into Instagram. But one of the things I've been trying to do with this is people that are coming to the talks when we do the show is try to add them and then get their really great shots from like their point of view of viewing the show, because that's really what, you learn from your audience as much as anything. And so if you guys would indulge me in that or add me, and if you want to keep a dialogue or a correspondence as you guys move forward with your art careers and stuff, I'm super supportive and love to look at other people's artwork and talk about art. You will not tire me out. I'm totally accessible to doing that and excited. So please.
Thank you. We'll start changing this up.
Thank you guys. Y'all were awesome.
Bye. Good night.
All right. Good night.
You know,